everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we are gonna go over my September wrap up and my October TBR. Spooky season is officially here. Break out your pumpkins and your ghosts and your weird creepy dolls. This is my favorite time of year. I absolutely love spooky season. It's so much fun. It doesn't take itself seriously. Everybody just has a good time. This is the best time of year. And it's also my birthday month. So happy birthday to all my fellow Libras out there. My birthday's on the 10th. And I last year went crazy and bought up a billion books, but I've been doing that all year long. So I'm not actually going on a shopping spree this year. And I say that now, but on my birthday, we'll just see how I behave myself. And I know I won't. But all you goblins and ghouls, please hit the like button and the subscribe button if you haven't already. That really helps me out with growing my channel, and I appreciate it so much. So let's just get into it. For the month of September, I didn't read as many books as I normally would. Normally I read like 6 or 7. This month I only managed to read 5, but one of those books was quite a long book and a labor-intensive book to read. I'll break that down later. But the books I read this month were The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, Red as Flame by Anthea Sharp. That is the third and final book in the Darkwood trilogy. The Marvelous Land of Oz by L. Frank Baum, Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll, and The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. That is the first book in the Wheel of Time series. Now let's take a closer look at the books I read in September. Spoiler warning for any and all of these books, especially The Eye of the World, the Wheel of Time book, because I'm going to have some complaints and I'm definitely going to spoil some things for that book. So if you don't want any of these books spoiled for you, just skip ahead to the next book. The first book I read in September was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. I have this entire series, the Oz series of 15 books, in a volumed set of 5, each book having 3 books in it. And for my late fine for not completing my summer TBR, I pulled the Wizard of Oz series, and so I am reading the first book in that collection, first volume, I should say, in that collection. And this month, I read 2 of those books, so let's start with the first one, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum is a classic children's fantasy book. It is the first book in the Oz series, and it was originally published in the year 1900. And this was a reread for me. I actually ended up listening to it on audiobook, and the prompt for this book was my late fine penalty for not completing my summer TBR, but I also ended up using it as a Tales from Two Trails the Battle prompt, and that prompt was a book published between 1900 and 1909. Now, while this book is incredibly famous, I'll give a little brief synopsis just for anyone who may not know. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz follows a girl named Dorothy who lives in Kansas, and she is swept away by a tornado in her home, and she lands in the land of Oz, and from there she tries to journey her way home. But the only way to get home is to get to the Emerald City and ask the wizard who lives there to send her back using magic. And, it's about the journey and the friends that she makes along the way and the lessons she learns about home. I always love this book. Of course, I gave it 5 stars again. To be fair, it should have been 4.75, but I rounded it up to 5 for nostalgia reasons. And if you've never read this book and even seen the movie, I highly recommend you check this one out because it is so very different from the movie Wizard of Oz that most of us know, the 1939 film. The vibes of these books are more like Return to Oz. If you've ever seen that movie, I think it's from the 80s or maybe the early 90s. They're very, very weird, and they would be so satisfying to read for the spooky season, and also for any goth emo kid out there, in any of you, you would really appreciate it if you have an inner weirdo, because these books are pretty bizarre. And they're really, really fast. I ended up reading each of these books in a day. So, I definitely recommend putting these on your TBR if you're in for something weird. Since I'm already on the subject of The Wizard of Oz, I'm going to skip ahead to the next book that I read out of that volume, and that is The Marvelous Land of Oz by L. Frank Baum, which was published in 1904. In The Marvelous Land of Oz, we don't actually follow Dorothy as our protagonist. We follow a young boy named Tip, and Tip kind of is a ward to an evil witch named Mombi. He was given to Mombi, and he likes to play practical jokes on her. She puts him to work, and after playing a practical joke on her when she's returning home, she is upset by him kind of for the last time and decides she's going to use a magical spell on him to turn him into a statue. Tip, not wanting to be a statue, runs away, and we kind of follow his adventure as he runs away. The friends he makes, just kind of like Dorothy, and him getting to the Emerald City. But in his journey of meeting the Scarecrow, who is now the King of Oz, he's actually runs right into a rebellion. General Ginger, who runs a group of young girls that's going to overthrow the city for its emeralds and make jewelry and things for themselves. They end up escaping from Oz and go and get the Tin Man, who is now the leader of the Winkies in the old Winky country where the Wicked Witch of the West was, and them kind of liberating the Emerald City from General Ginger and all the people that he meets along the way. And this book was not as good as the first one. I gave it 3.75 stars, so it was still a fun adventure. And again, very, very weird. The idea of the Gump gives me nightmares. Like, he is nightmare fuel. He's made out of like an elk moose type head that is attached to two sofas so they can sit on it like a plane. And I don't know. I don't even know, like, it's so weird, and he doesn't want to be alive, and, you know, like Forky or Sporky from Toy Story 4 wants to throw himself away because he's garbage. The Gump doesn't want to be alive, and he's just very, very, very fucking weird. But I would say this, again, is just such a weird, bizarre book, and I will say it had an ending I didn't see coming, so that was a cool little twist, because, you know, a book that's 120 years old, the plot's not spoiled. So that's fun. So if you want a very weird book, again, I would recommend checking out the Oz series. Backtracking now to Red as Flame. This is the third and final book in the Darkwood trilogy. It is a young adult fantasy book, and it was published in 2022. And although this book was the third and final book in this series, there is a companion series to this series. It takes place 100 years before this one, and a novella that comes in between the two, and I will eventually read those as well. So there were a few prompts that I used this book for. For my TBR game library card, this was a folklore and fairy tale genre that was set in a fictional world, and I also used it for Tale for Two Trails to Battle, for my random animal generator, which was a horned frog, and I matched those up having similar colors. The horned frog picture has him being yellow, green, and red, and this cover obviously has yellow, green, and red on it. Spoilers for the story of this book, since it is the third in the series. We follow Rose as she meets her long estranged father, who is actually the Red Priest who hunted her at the end of the previous book. She escaped from him, but he has pursued her to take her back to train her because she actually does have fire magic. All this time she's wanted this power, she's wanted this magic, but her mother had sequestered it in her with a dark magic charm from a witch that resulted in her getting her finger cut off as part of a blood sacrifice to kind of conceal her magic so her father couldn't find her. And her love Thorn are separated again. They spend so much time apart. I read these books pining for Thorn the same way that Rose does. It drives me crazy because he's the more interesting character to me, and I almost never get to see him in these books. So, I did like this book. I gave it 3.75 stars. I thought it was a fitting conclusion to the trilogy, but I do wish that there had been a little bit more fairy tale in this story, and I wish there would have been a little bit more of the original story of Rose Red and Snow White in this story, as it took its own turn into being a story more about dark elves and magic than about the original fairy tale. I also think this story would have been stronger, like the trilogy as a whole would have been stronger as a multi POV story. I didn't find Rose to be the most interesting protagonist. I thought Thorn and Neve, I'm not really sure how you say her name. I thought they were far more interesting characters than Rose was. So I would think it would give it some dimension to have had them as POV chapters as well. And I thought this book was a little bit too predictable. I guess just because it's a YA book, it follows a very formulaic routine. But the villain was predictable and lacking depth. So many of the betrayals I saw coming a mile away, and really Rose should have too, and her not seeing it coming kind of irritated me, considering this is the book where she's coming into her own. But overall, I still did really enjoy this entire series and this book, and I felt like they did get better as, the story went on. The second book was probably my favorite in this series, but if you are looking for a retelling, or if you are looking for a clean book, this book is zero spice. It would be great for teenagers, great for anti-spicers, and good for retellings. Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll is a historical fiction crime book, and it was published in 2023. This book is from the female victim and survivor's perspective of the Ted Bundy murders. The prompts I had for this book for my library card TBR was a realistic fiction with a pretty cover, and for A Tale from Two Trails, The Battle was my choice for my multi-POV book. Now, my overall opinion of this book was that it was good, not great. It's advertised as something of a thriller, but it's much more of a historical fiction. I overall rated this book 3.5 stars. Good, not great. I didn't hate it. My biggest issue with this book was the writing. It was multi-POV and multi-timeline, and it was a little bit confusing going back and forth through the timelines. Now, even though I didn't think it was the greatest book ever, I did really enjoy my time with it. I read it relatively quickly in just a few days, and I would recommend it if you like stories about serial killers, or if you want to see a book take the power away from the murderer and give it back to the survivors and the victims, because that was really the aim of this book, is to make it about the women that he's victimized and not about him being a great superior being because he was a shitbag. And this book really loves to make it a point to make us know that he was a shitbag. And he was. And I did away with true crime books for myself recently, so to read a more fictionalized version from a different perspective I thought was great. And I really preferred it to a true crime book where you have to read all the sick details of everything that happened. This is really more about the survivor's guilt, sisterhood, grief, loss, those kind of things. Now let's get into the reason that I didn't get to read that many books this month. The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan is the first book in the Wheel of Time series, and it was published in 1990, and it is an epic high fantasy series. My prompts for this book from my library card game was a book from my reading list that has a map, and the list I pulled it from was the Buzzwordathon list. I used this book for the buzzword for senses, I being the buzzword. Now, where do I start with this book? Let's start by saying I gave it 3 stars. The Eye of the World is about a group of country people whose town has been visited by a sorceress and her warder. She's called an Aes Sedai. She's a witch, a sorceress, a powerful being. A warder is her sworn shield, who is a seasoned, battled veteran combat extraordinaire. And in this country village of the Two Rivers, there are 3 young men who are being pursued, hunted out by the dark being of this realm. After an attack on Beltane, which is like their festival, there's an attack by the Dark One. He sends in all these creatures, Trollocs they're called, attacks the village, burns down things, but they are really targeted attacks looking for these young men. And so it is decided that the witch, her warder, these three young men, and then a young girl in the village named Egwene, who ends up having powers like the witch, she's gonna go with them. Also in the town for Beltane, there is a gleeman. He is a performer. He tells stories kind of like a bard. And they're all gonna leave the village to protect the village from getting attacked any further. And they go on this long ass quest to get answers as to why the Dark One is seeking out these three young men in particular. And along the journey, the wisdom of the village, her name is Nynaeve, she joins them trying to bring these boys back to the village. And underneath that whole story is the theme that time is cylindrical in this universe. It is not linear. And throughout time, throughout all of the history, there has been a champion of the light known as the dragon who goes up against the Dark One, and presumably one of these three young men is that champion. That's why they're being hunted down. And all of that story in and of itself is interesting. I'm intrigued. I would read that kind of story. I like that kind of story. But here's the problem with this book in particular, and I swear, I pray, I hope that the rest of the series is not the same. It is repetitive. Half of this book, it was 744 pages. Half of this book could have been cut out and replaced with the words, and it went on that way for a while. Because there are chapter after chapter, like hundreds of pages of repetition where two of the boys, Matt and Rand, the main character, those two are stopping at an inn and performing and, getting their room and board paid for. And they're tracked down by, dark friends, people that work or are servants to the Dark One who are looking for them. They get found out. They have to run in the night or, whatever. Some disaster happens. And it happens over and over and over and over and over again. And I did not need to read the details of every single one of those things happening. It could have been summed up, and it went on that way for a while with a brief explanation of the pattern that was taking place and continuing on with the story. It drove me insane. I had to force myself to read and finish this book. I also listened to the audiobook along with reading it because I couldn't focus on reading it. I had to make me read this book. If I did not already own the next 6 books in this series, I might have DNF'd this book. It was that brutal to get through, which is unfortunate because I do like the overall story. So I'm hoping in future books in this series that the repetition is cut out. And I know that the repetition in this story serves to parallel the repetition in time and to establish a pattern. Pattern is a very strong theme in this book, but it was just rough, you guys. So would I recommend this book? No, not really. I kind of wouldn't. Only to extreme high fantasy nerds who can deal with having a 15-book series that might be extremely long, extremely slow, and extremely repetitive. Beware. So that was my September. The best book, my favorite book that I read this month was definitely The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Touches my heart every time. I love it. The worst book I read this month was The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, and at 3 stars, that's really not that bad. With all of that behind us, let's move on to October and the spooky reads I'll be reading this month. Let's start with rollovers. There were a few books that I didn't get to last month because The Eye of the World destroyed my soul and I couldn't get anything else done. So I mentioned earlier that I was reading the first volume in my 5-volume collection of the Oz series, and in that volume I have one more story to read, and that is Ozma of Oz, the 3rd book in the Oz series by L. Frank Baum. Also rolling over from September is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier from my library card TBR, and this is a mystery with a black cover. For the Buzzwordathon this month, our buzzword is relationships, and I will be reading the Ex Hex by Erin Sterling. The rest of the books I'll be reading in October are from my library card TBR. Library card is the TBR game I play here on my channel, and those books are The Return by Rachel Harrison for a suspense book by a female author. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson for a mystery published before 1900, and this will be a reread for me. A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson for a horror book with blood on the cover. The Night House by Joe Nesbo for a mystery that is a translated book. And A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess for a dystopian published between 1950 and 1970. And that's it. Those are all the books I'll be reading in October. Leave me a comment below if you've made it this far with a little pumpkin. Tell me all about the books that you're reading for spooky season. I would love more recommendations. What do you think about the books I read? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's talk about it. And I will catch you all in the next one. Bye.